Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The morning of April 3rd had begun like every other in our quiet neighborhood, roosters crowing in an even rhythm, sleepy shopkeepers setting up their stands, and mothers calling out last-minute instructions to children with half-packed school bags. I stood by my window sipping warm cocoa when I saw him, Richard Harris. He was always early on days like that. Crisp white shirt, briefcase in one hand, car keys in the other. He paused for a second to wave at me, that same bright smile that made people trust him too easily. "Tell Tom I'll bring his football later," he shouted across the fence. I smiled and nodded. He looked up at the sky briefly, as though reading something in the clouds, then got into his dusty blue sedan and drove off down the gravel road, heading toward the school to pick up his son, Liam. It never occurred to me that I would be the last familiar face he'd ever waved to. 2 hours later, the air had changed. It was thicker, heavier, like something unseen had settled over the village. A whisper started at the junction, then rolled like thunder toward the heart of town. There'd been an accident. A bad one. Nobody knew the details yet, only that a car had failed to stop on the hill road near the bend by Miller's Creek. They said it somersaulted. Others said it skidded off the path entirely and hit a pole. The stories came like broken glass, sharp and scattered. I was in the backyard hanging wet laundry when Sarah, Richard's wife, rushed past my fence barefoot, her hospital ID swinging wildly around her neck. She didn't even see me. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, like she was chasing something no one else could see. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. I dropped the wet bedsheet in the basin and called my son to fetch my shawl. Something terrible had happened, and I had a feeling the worst part hadn't arrived yet. At exactly 4:23 p.m., I stood at the gates of Little Cedars Primary School. Liam was still there, alone. The other children had all gone, some with their parents, others with housemaids or older siblings. He stood near the old mango tree, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, kicking a small stone around with the tip of his shoe. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He just kept looking down the road like he believed his father would still come. When I called out his name, he looked up slowly, almost reluctantly, as though stepping away from a promise he didn't want to break. "Auntie Green," he said softly, blinking too much. "Is Dad late again?" I knelt in front of him, smoothed back his curly hair, and lied. I told him his father had been delayed at work, and that I was taking him home for now. I held his tiny hand all the way back, not knowing that even as we walked, Richard Harris was taking his last breath in a hospital ward that smelled of antiseptic and regret. The house on Benson Lane grew quiet after Richard's burial. Not the soft, peaceful kind of quiet that follows healing, but the heavy, suffocating silence that settles after something important has been torn from a place. The curtains stayed drawn most days. Plates remained untouched in the sink. Liam took to sitting by the back door in the afternoons, watching lizards scurry along the cracked fence wall. Sarah barely ate. She moved like a ghost, floating between rooms in her late husband's oversized sweater, her hair always tied up in a messy bun she didn't bother fixing. The village mourned for a while, of course. Neighbors brought food wrapped in foil and said things like "be strong" and "God knows best." But eventually they stopped coming. The pity faded, and in its place grew something far colder, suspicion. Whispers began creeping in from the market and the church steps. People started to say it was odd how the accident happened just days after Richard signed new land papers. Some even claimed Sarah had been planning something, that she'd always seemed too eager for wealth. It was nonsense, all of it, but in our village nonsense has strong roots. The brothers came less than a week later. 3 of them, Jude, Caleb, and the one everyone called Big T. They arrived in a dusty black Hilux, their voices loud even before they entered the compound. Sarah wasn't surprised. She stood on the front porch, arms crossed, her eyes dry. I watched from behind my fence as the confrontation unfolded. They asked for documents, deed papers, bank statements, business records. When she asked them why, Jude simply said, "You're only the wife, not the blood." That was the moment the tone changed. Sarah told them Richard had made his will privately, but before she could explain further, Big T pushed past her into the house. Caleb followed. No shame, no hesitation. They rummaged through drawers, opened cabinets, even took down a frame from the wall as if secrets might fall out. Sarah shouted, told them to stop, but they ignored her. Liam, peeking from behind the curtain, started to cry quietly. It was the kind of cry that didn't make sound, just long breaths and wet cheeks, and all I could do was stand there and listen, helpless and angry. The days that followed turned the home into a battleground. The brothers claimed Sarah was hiding assets, that she wasn't legally entitled to anything since Richard hadn't formally signed a will. They moved into one of the guest rooms, without permission, and began changing things. First, they hired a local carpenter to strip the locks and install new ones. Then they brought a lawyer, some man with a crooked tie and a briefcase that smelled like mothballs. He delivered a notice of property reassessment. The house no longer belonged to Sarah, he said, not unless she could prove otherwise. She tried to fight back. She called the local council, reached out to the family pastor, but nobody wanted to be in the middle. People feared the Harris brothers. They were loud, wealthy, and had influence in the right places. Liam became quieter. He stopped asking about his father. He stopped talking altogether sometimes. Sarah's eyes looked more tired each morning, like they hadn't closed the night before. And one day, without warning, she came to my house, handed me a folded piece of paper, and said in a hoarse voice, "I need to reach David. I need my brother." It rained the morning Sarah tried to return to her own bedroom. Not a soft drizzle, but the kind of rain that came down angry, drumming against the roof like fists. She'd woken up early, earlier than usual, and I could see her from my window, standing at the edge of the porch, arms folded, staring at the front door, as though trying to remember something. She hadn't slept in the main room since the brothers forced their way into the house. Instead, she and Liam shared the small guest room near the kitchen, where the walls smelled faintly of kerosene and mildew. But that morning, something changed in her. Maybe it was the way Liam had curled up the night before, whispering, "I miss him," into the thin pillow. Or maybe it was just the weight of having to explain again and again to a 6-year-old why they couldn't enter their own living room. Whatever it was, Sarah decided to reclaim something of hers. She walked slowly to the master bedroom, turned the handle, and found it locked. From the inside. She knocked once, twice. No answer. Then Jude's voice, muffled but firm. "This room is under review. Legal occupancy issues." That's what he said, like it was some office space and not the room where she and Richard had planned their son's future. Sarah didn't reply. She just stood there, her fingers still on the door handle. Liam came up behind her, holding his old plastic dinosaur in one hand. "Why is Uncle Jude in Daddy's room?" he asked. She didn't answer him either. She simply turned around, guided him gently back down the hallway, and said nothing for the rest of the day. That silence, it became a pattern. Sarah, once vibrant and outspoken, stopped arguing. She didn't yell when Big T parked his muddy boots on her front step, or when Caleb tossed out Richard's books from the study and replaced them with boxes labeled company records. She didn't even flinch when their lawyer showed up again and gave her a thick brown envelope marked Notice of Occupancy Reassignment. I knew then that she wasn't giving up. She was planning something. Something quiet, maybe even desperate, but something. The house stopped feeling like a home after that. Even the furniture seemed confused. The dining chairs stayed tucked in too neatly. The old family clock in the hallway stopped ticking, its pendulum stilled as if it, too, was grieving. Sarah began to sleep with her shoes on, ready, I think, in case someone came knocking in the night. And Liam, he started drawing things. Strange, scribbled sketches of cars with missing wheels, or stick figures with large frowns and tear-shaped eyes. One day, he handed me a crumpled page showing a tall man beside a house split in half, one side black, the other white. "This is where we live," he said simply. I took the drawing home and pinned it on my kitchen wall, unsure if it was a warning or a cry for help. Then, one evening, just as the sun was slipping beneath the hills, Sarah came over drenched from head to toe, holding a soggy envelope wrapped in a plastic bag. "Do you know anyone going to the city this week?" she asked. I told her yes, the baker's cousin was traveling. She nodded and handed me the bag. "I need this to get to New York. To my brother David." I didn't ask questions. I just took it, knowing whatever was inside had to be the start of something, anything, before the silence swallowed her whole. The envelope Sarah sent took nearly 3 weeks to reach New York. The baker's cousin passed it to a relative flying out of Abuja, who handed it to someone else in London, who then mailed it through a small international courier service that only delivered on Thursdays. We tracked every whisper of its journey from the village. Each morning, Sarah would stop by my house just to ask, "Any news yet?" and I'd shake my head gently. Her voice had grown softer, like each word cost her something. She still avoided the main house. The brothers carried on as if they'd always lived there, hosting loud meetings, bringing in strange men with measuring tapes and calculators, talking about things like market value and liquid assets. Sarah didn't challenge them. Not anymore. Her strength had been buried somewhere between grief and exhaustion. But every night, after Liam had gone to sleep, she sat by the small wooden table in the kitchen and stared at her phone, waiting for a call from a brother she hadn't seen in 8 years. David always said he'd come back one day, but no one thought he actually would. He'd left the village when he was barely 22, chasing a scholarship to study engineering in the U.S., and eventually stayed back when life there opened new doors. He called on birthdays, sent money sometimes, but he had built a life far from the tangled roots of home. Sarah never resented him for it. She was proud of him, told everyone that her brother works with machines in tall buildings, even when she didn't quite know what that meant. But after Richard's death, her pride gave way to a quiet longing. She needed David not for what he had become, but for who he had always been, the boy who once walked miles to sell mangoes so she could buy school shoes. The letter she wrote him was handwritten on lined paper, soaked slightly at the corners from tears she hadn't bothered to hide. It told him everything, about the accident, the property disputes, the brothers who turned cruel, and the silence she'd been forced to live in. She ended it with a single line. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I just need you to know." Then, one sweltering afternoon, when even the air in the village seemed too tired to move, David arrived. No one saw him come. He didn't make a call ahead. He just showed up, dusty jeans, a small black backpack, and eyes that carried a different kind of fire. He walked into my compound first, asking softly, "Is my sister home?" I called for Sarah, and when she stepped outside and saw him standing there, she froze. Not from fear, but disbelief. Her mouth parted slightly, her eyes wide, and then she broke. The tears came without sound, and she fell into his arms like a tree finally allowed to lean. He didn't ask questions, not right away. That night, they sat in the backyard long after Liam had fallen asleep, 2 shadows lit by a weak lantern. I watched from my porch as Sarah told him everything again, slower this time. David didn't interrupt. He just sat still, his jaw tightening with every word. And when she was done, he said just 5 words. "They won't take what's ours." It began quietly, like most storms do, calm air, no warning. David didn't come in with fists raised or threats shouted into the night. That wasn't his way. Instead, he spent the first few days walking, around the compound, around the village, around the places that had not changed since he left. He greeted the elders with quiet respect and listened as they offered cautious welcomes laced with unspoken questions. In the evenings, he sat with Liam, asking about school and what games he liked, not pushing, just listening. The boy took to him quickly. There was something steady about David, a calm beneath the surface that drew people in. But make no mistake, behind that calm, there was a growing heat. I saw it the first time he watched Big T toss a crate of old furniture into the pickup truck like it meant nothing. David said nothing then, but his eyes followed every movement, every snare. He was taking notes, in his head, in his heart. He asked Sarah for the documents, birth certificates, marriage license, Richard's business records, the deed to the house, and spread them out on the kitchen table like pieces of a broken puzzle. Some were stained at the edges, others folded too many times, but they were still proof. Proof that Richard had built everything with Sarah, not his brothers. David stayed up late, calling lawyers from the city with borrowed phones, scribbling notes, piecing together the legal trail his sister had never been strong enough to follow alone. One night, he brought in a tall man with thick glasses named Mr. Uche, a property rights attorney from Asaba who owed David a favor from college days. Together, they reviewed every file, every name, every date. Sarah sat in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes heavy, but for the first time in weeks, she looked like someone who believed in hope again. The brothers noticed the change. Jude tried to corner David near the gate one morning, asked what business a foreign boy had in family matters. David looked him squarely in the face and said, "The kind that protects what my brother built." And just like that, the air shifted. It wasn't long before official papers followed. David filed an injunction, halting all property claims until the matter was heard in court. The Harris brothers were stunned. They had built their power on intimidation and fear, but now found themselves tethered to a system they couldn't manipulate so easily. Caleb began to grow nervous, pacing during the day and whispering into his phone behind closed doors. Big T grew angrier, slamming doors, blaming everyone but himself. Sarah stayed quiet. She knew this fight wasn't hers anymore. She had passed the torch to a brother who had once carried mangoes on his head for her, and who now carried the weight of justice on his shoulders. Liam followed David everywhere. In his drawings, the broken house was starting to take shape again. The split down the middle was still there, but now there was a figure standing in the center, holding the two sides together. A man with glasses and kind eyes, drawn in blue crayon. The boy didn't know it yet, but his world was beginning to mend, piece by piece. The courthouse was an old, weather-worn building at the edge of town, with peeling paint and benches that creaked beneath even the smallest weight. But on the morning of the hearing, it felt like the center of the world. Sarah wore a modest brown dress and held Liam's hand tightly as they approached. David walked just ahead, his back straight, his step steady. It had rained the night before, and the air was still damp, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and hope. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread fast, as it often did in places like ours. Curious neighbors, distant relatives, and even those who'd whispered cruel things about Sarah now sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see what would unfold. On the far side of the room, the Harris brothers sat with their lawyer, a different one this time, younger and dressed in an oversized blazer. Jude avoided eye contact. Big T stared openly, arms crossed, while Caleb sat nervously biting his lip. When the judge entered, the room fell into a hush so complete you could hear the rustling of Liam's notebook as he scribbled quietly on Sarah's lap. David rose first. He spoke clearly, not with anger, but with truth. He laid out every document, ownership papers, receipts, business registrations in Richard's name. He explained how Sarah had jointly supported the home and helped expand the small electronics shop that Richard started years ago. He even had records showing that none of the brothers had ever contributed financially or otherwise to the property. Mr. Uche followed, reinforcing each point with legal precision, referencing acts and clauses that most in the room didn't understand, but they could feel the weight of his words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Sarah was called. She stood slowly, her hands trembling just a little, and walked to the witness box. At first, her voice cracked. But as she spoke about Richard, about the early years, about how she begged his family to accept her, it grew steadier. She didn't accuse. She didn't insult. She simply told the truth of her life with a man who loved her, and the silence that followed his death. After hours of testimony, questions, and legal back and forth, the judge called a recess. People spilled out of the courtroom murmuring, guessing what might happen next. Sarah sat on the edge of a bench beneath a mango tree just outside the court, her head leaning against David's shoulder. The tension that had lived in her body for months seemed to ease just slightly. Liam played nearby with a twig, poking holes into the soft ground, humming to himself. When the court reconvened, the verdict came swiftly. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and a measured tone, ruled in favor of Sarah. She declared the house and business legally hers and her son's. Any further claims by the Harris brothers were nullified. Jude stood abruptly, his face red with disbelief. Caleb said nothing. Big T cursed under his breath, but it was over. The gavel fell like a thunderclap. No one clapped. No one shouted. But the silence was no longer heavy. It was full. Full of something that had been long denied. Justice. The day after the ruling, the house on Benson Lane was silent. Not the kind of silence that suffocates, but a deep, cleansing quiet that seemed to breathe with the walls. Sarah stood in the center of the living room, the same space that had once been claimed by her husband's brothers, and ran her hand gently over the surface of the dining table. Dust clung to her fingers, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she moved slowly through the house, touching things, chairs, curtain edges, old framed photographs, as if to reintroduce herself to a life that had been paused. Liam followed behind her, not speaking, just watching her closely. Every room they entered, he looked around with wide, curious eyes, like he was seeing it for the first time. Later, when she reached the master bedroom, Sarah stopped at the threshold. She stood there for a long time before finally opening the door. It smelled faintly of old perfume and something else, something that lived deep in the walls. She didn't cry. She just walked in, opened the windows, and let the light in. David spent the next few days arranging the sale. It wasn't easy. Memories clung to the house like old vines, and even though they had won the case, letting go was harder than anyone expected. But Sarah had made her decision. She wanted to leave not out of bitterness, but because the house had become a place of echoes, and she needed somewhere quieter to heal. With David's help, the property was sold legally to a family from out of town, a couple with 2 little girls who fell in love with the mango tree out back. The business Richard had started was also sold, the proceeds carefully gathered and deposited into a trust account for Liam's future. No celebration followed, no farewell party. On the last morning in the house, Sarah packed slowly while Liam played with the same toy dinosaur he had clung to all those months. David stood by the gate, speaking softly into his phone, confirming flight details. When the car arrived to take them to the airport, Sarah walked through the compound one final time, her eyes touching everything but lingering on nothing. She didn't say goodbye to the house. She simply whispered, "Thank you," and walked away. Their flight to the United States was quiet. Liam fell asleep before the plane even lifted off the runway, his head resting on Sarah's lap. She stared out the window for a long time, watching the clouds shift and roll like waves. David sat across the aisle, flipping through documents, but every now and then his eyes would drift to his sister and her son, just to make sure they were still all right. The journey was long, but it didn't feel heavy, not the way life had felt before. When they finally landed in New York, the cold air met them like a sharp breath, and Liam's eyes lit up at the sight of snow for the first time. It was a new beginning. Not one filled with immediate joy or ease, but one shaped by survival, by resilience. In a small apartment just outside the city, they started again. Sarah found work in a neighborhood clinic. Liam began school and slowly began to laugh again. David remained close, always nearby, always watching. And in that new life, beneath unfamiliar skies, something took root, something gentle and strong. Not a replacement for what was lost, but the quiet growth of something new. Years passed like slow-moving water, shaping Liam in quiet ways. In New York, time didn't shout, it hummed. The seasons changed with certainty, and with each turn of autumn to winter, then back to spring, the boy became someone new. Liam grew tall and quiet, with the same thoughtful eyes his father once had. He took to drawing more seriously, often staying up late with sketchbooks scattered across his bed, headphones on, his world tucked behind graphite lines and shaded paper. His teachers noticed his talent, but more than that, they noticed his discipline. He worked like someone with something to prove, though no one ever pushed him to. Sarah worked long hours at the clinic, and David, though busy with his own life, never missed a school event or a birthday. Their small apartment was modest, but it held a peace they had never known back home. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it had softened, thinned out across time like mist. And through it all, Liam held on to one quiet dream, to return home, not in sorrow, but in strength. By the time he was 22, Liam had completed a degree in architecture. It was fitting in a way that he would choose a field that involved rebuilding, reshaping, bringing form to things once broken. His final year project was a structure he called House of Roots, a warm, open building with wide hallways and rooms that bled sunlight. When asked about the inspiration, he simply said, "It's based on the kind of home people deserve." That answer stayed with his professors, one of whom helped connect him to an internship at a respected firm. Liam saved every cent he could, living simply, not because he had to, but because he carried an understanding of value, of what it meant to lose and gain. When Sarah finally retired from the clinic, he told her quietly one evening over tea, "I'm going back." She didn't ask why. She only nodded and reached across the table to hold his hand. David, now married and living upstate, offered to go with him, but Liam declined. "I need to see it through," he said, "alone." So he returned, not with a flourish, but with calm determination. The flight back to Nigeria felt surreal. The land looked the same from above, fields, red roofs, winding roads, but something inside him was different now. He stayed in a modest hotel near the village and didn't announce his presence. He walked through the town like a shadow, observing, listening. Much had changed. New shops had appeared, the old bakery was gone, and a new school building stood where the community center used to be. But the land where his father's house had once stood, now owned by a distant relative of the couple who bought it, had been left to rot, walls cracked, roof caved in, windows shattered. Liam stood before it in silence for a long time, breathing in the scent of red earth and memory. Then he made an offer to buy it back, not just the house, but the land around it. The offer was accepted without resistance. And so, without telling anyone why, he began to build. Locals whispered. Some said he was just a rich city boy with sentiment in his blood. But slowly, piece by piece, a new structure began to rise. Clean lines, open space, strong foundation. It wasn't just a house. It was a reclaiming. A quiet testament to where he came from and to the man he had become. Liam spent his mornings at the construction site, not as a visitor, but as someone deeply involved in every decision. He walked through the rising walls with rolled-up sleeves and dust on his boots, nodding at the workers, sometimes grabbing a shovel or helping with measurements. The villagers watched from a distance, some with quiet respect, others with uneasy curiosity. No one had seen a Harris boy in years, not since the court ruling turned the tides. They whispered when he passed, not out of mockery, but because he carried something that reminded them of what was once lost, his father's quiet strength, his mother's silent resilience. Liam never addressed the whispers. He just kept building, He visited the local school, donated new supplies, and offered to redesign the classrooms at no charge. The headmaster, an old man with stiff knees, looked at him with something between surprise and gratitude. Liam's presence stirred the soil, but not everything buried was content to stay hidden. It was on a humid afternoon, as clouds began to gather above the half-finished structure, that Liam saw him. Caleb, the oldest of the Harris brothers. His hair had thinned, his belly sagged beneath a faded shirt, but Liam recognized him instantly. He stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the new fence, looking not at the building, but at Liam himself. For a moment neither moved. The years between them hung like fog. Then Caleb took a step forward and raised his hand in a cautious wave. Liam didn't return it. He turned instead, instructing a worker about the steel placement near the foundation, but Caleb didn't leave. The next day, he returned, this time bringing a younger man with him, someone who might have been a nephew or son. Liam kept his distance, but by the third visit, something shifted. Caleb called out, soft enough to be mistaken for a sigh, "Liam, I just want to talk." And though everything inside him said to walk away, Liam paused. They met at a small roadside table near the old fuel station. Caleb ordered 2 bottles of malt and said little at first. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the cold glass. "I didn't know about the break," he said finally, voice hoarse. "I didn't know what Thomas did until it was too late." Liam didn't blink. He listened, his face unreadable. Caleb went on, about the morning of the accident, how Thomas had returned to the village suddenly, spreading rumors about Sarah, stirring old bitterness. "We were angry," he confessed, "but not enough to kill him. Only Thomas." He trailed off, shaking his head. Liam asked quietly, "Where is he now?" Caleb didn't know. "Said Thomas vanished years ago, last seen heading toward Port Harcourt. I just wanted to see the boy again," Caleb added. "I needed to see what became of him." Liam stood slowly, the chair scraping back. "You're looking at him," he said, "and he remembers everything." Then he walked away, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. Some things, even when forgiven, can never be unremembered. The house was finished by the time the harmattan winds began to sweep across the land, dusting the rooftops in fine red earth and turning the air dry and brittle. Liam stood in the center of the new courtyard, his hands in his pockets, watching the last rays of sunlight fall against the smooth cream walls. The building was simple, not extravagant, just like the drawings he once sketched in a cramped New York bedroom. Every corner of it had meaning. The wide porch with 2 chairs, like the ones his parents used to sit in on warm nights, the tall windows that caught the breeze, the quiet room at the back, made into a small library, filled with books and a framed photograph of Richard and Sarah, taken long before grief became a houseguest. Villagers passed by often now, offering greetings and subtle nods. Some brought gifts, bananas, carved wooden stools, a basket of cola nuts. They no longer whispered. The boy had returned, not as an outsider, but as one of them. And he had rebuilt not only the house, but the dignity that once lived within it. One quiet morning, just as Liam was reviewing some paperwork in the front sitting room, a knock came. Not hurried, not aggressive, just 3 soft, deliberate taps. He opened the door to find a police officer and 2 plainclothesmen standing behind him. One of the men held a folder, thick and worn at the edges. "Mr. Liam Harris?" the officer asked. Liam nodded. "We believe you may want to see this," the man said, handing him the folder. Inside were documents, old reports, witness statements, and photographs. At the bottom was a name he hadn't heard aloud in years, Thomas Harris. An informant in Port Harcourt had tipped them off weeks earlier about a man living under a false identity who often spoke in half-drunken confessions about a family torn by one mistake. A search had confirmed his real name, and the pieces had finally come together. Your uncle, the officer said plainly, was involved in the tampering of the brake line. We believe it was deliberate. Liam's hand stayed still on the folder, but his heartbeat moved like thunder. The officer continued, He's being brought in. We thought you should know. Liam didn't react with fury or joy. He simply walked out to the porch and sat down in the left chair, his father's spot, by the old design. The wind had picked up, stirring the mango tree at the edge of the compound. He stared at the road in front of the house, the same road his father had never returned on so many years ago. It was strange how time folded, how the very path that once broke him now stretched open in peace. That evening, Sarah called from New York. Her voice was softer now, aged but calm. She asked if he was all right, and he said yes. He meant it. After the call, Liam walked to the back room, placed the folder on a shelf beside his father's photograph, and turned off the light. Outside, the village was quiet. He stood in the doorway for a long while, breathing in the dry, cool air. The home was whole again, not just in wood and stone, but in memory, in truth. And for the first time in a long time, Liam felt not like someone who had come back, but someone who had finally arrived. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.